Can you imagine what the streets and freeways would be like without a system of traffic regulation or driver qualification? Demolition derby, right? Well, you'll be glad to know that the National Airspace System is well regulated, peopled with qualified pilots, and in no way resembles a demolition derby. So let's talk about some of the rules of instrument flying that make things orderly. When you get your instrument rating, your new certificate will contain just 2 additional words: instrument airplane. What that means is that you are instrument qualified, but it also means in airplane only. The FAA has wisely said that you can't fly different categories of aircraft on instruments unless you're instrument rated in that category. So, for instance, if you're going to fly a helicopter on instruments, you need an instrument helicopter rating. Now, let's see when you need an instrument rating. Well, you need an instrument rating to fly in weather that is below VFR weather minimums. The term for that kind of weather is instrument meteorological conditions. But, well, that's a mouthful, so we just say IMC. And what exactly is IMC? Well, it varies depending on your altitude, the kind of airspace you're in, and sometimes the time of day. For example, when you're flying in Class E airspace below 10,000 feet and the visibility is less than 3 miles, you are in IMC. But when you're flying in Class G airspace during the day below 1,200 feet, you aren't in IMC until the visibility is less than 1 mile. Now, there are 2 situations when you need an instrument rating even when the weather is VFR. First, to poke your nose into Class A airspace, which, as you know, is from 18,000 feet up to flight level 600, you must be instrument rated. Good weather, bad weather, it makes no difference. When you fly in Class A airspace, it's all IFR. Second, to file an IFR flight plan, you must be instrument rated, even if it's a beautiful, clear day, you know, not a cloud in the sky and you can see all the way to Independence. So, let's talk about IFR flight plans and clearances. You can think of an IFR flight plan as your application for a clearance. And when do you need an IFR clearance? Well, first, you need an IFR clearance when you're flying IMC in controlled airspace. And second, you need an IFR clearance to fly in Class A airspace. But you ask, what about when I'm flying IMC in Class G airspace, uncontrolled airspace? Well, think about it this way. If you're in uncontrolled airspace, there are no ATC separation services provided, so a controller cannot issue you a clearance. Here's an example. Let's say you intend to depart an airport with 1 mile visibility in Class G airspace, and then you want to continue your flight into IMC in controlled airspace, Class A, B, C, D, or E. You file an instrument flight plan and you receive a clearance, but guess what? Your clearance will start with the phrase, "Upon entering controlled airspace." Well, a clearance that begins like this does not cover you while you're flying in uncontrolled airspace. Uncontrolled or Class G airspace, as you remember, usually includes the first 700 or 1,200 feet after you leave the ground, plus, in some parts of the country, the area between the airways. So, in Class G airspace, you're on your own. In other words, be aware that there could be someone else flying around in the clouds in Class G sky with you, and no one is required to be talking to a controller. You'll find that many instrument pilots file an IFR flight plan for all their cross-country flights, even on VFR days. The reason is simple and solid. It keeps them familiar with how the system works, and it's the best flight following there is. Besides, it saves a ton of headaches over airspace restrictions. Because when ATC issues your IFR clearance, they've given you a pass through all the controlled airspace along your entire route. Now, there is another case where an instrument rating, while not technically required, is certainly a must for practical purposes. Commercial airplane pilots who don't have an instrument rating have a limitation on their pilot certificates that says the carriage of passengers for hire on cross-country flights in excess of 50 nautical miles or at night is prohibited. So in order to get full use from a commercial certificate, it pays to be instrument rated. Now let's see how your airplane must be equipped for IFR flight. You recall from your student pilot days that long list of things that were required in an airplane for day VFR flight. Let's take a look. There's an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, a magnetic compass, a tachometer, an oil pressure gauge, an oil temperature gauge, a fuel gauge, anti-collision lights, seat belts and harnesses, and of course an ELT. For night VFR flight, you need, in addition, position lights and an electrical source. Well, for IFR, you'll need all that equipment, both day and night, and a whole lot more to aviate, navigate, and communicate successfully in IMC. So for IFR flight, here's what else you need. A communications radio, so you can talk to the controller. Navigation equipment, appropriate to the ground facilities you'll be using. What's appropriate depends on the airways and approaches you'll be flying. Redundancy in your comm and nav radios isn't required. One of each is okay, but when you're in the clouds, it's sure a lot more comforting to have two nav comms like your new Skyhawk has. A turn coordinator, a slip skid indicator, that's the ball, a sensitive altimeter, that's an altimeter with a window where you can put the current altimeter setting, a clock for making en route estimates and timing your approaches, so it needs to have a sweep second hand. A digital display which counts the seconds is okay too. An alternator, an attitude indicator, and a heading indicator. As you can see, that's quite a list of instruments and equipment required for IFR flight. But if you don't have them, don't leave home IFR without them. Now there's one piece of equipment that, while it's not required for IFR flight, will certainly make your life easier, and that's a transponder. It's really hard for a controller to track your airplane if it doesn't have a transponder. So you'll find your service from ATC is a lot better when you do have one. Now there's one more requirement that you should know about, although you won't ever encounter it in your Skyhawk. If you're above flight level 240, 24,000 feet pressure altitude, and you are navigating by VOR, then you must also have DME, or an acceptable substitute like an IFR-approved GPS. So in order to enjoy all the flexibility that an instrument rating brings you, you need a current IFR rating, an instrument flight plan, and an IFR clearance, and a whole passel of instruments and electronics. But once you've got all that, you can launch into IMC confident that your flight through the clouds will in no way resemble a demolition derby.